Christy is going to, Christy is a sixth grade science and math teacher at McCurdy Charter School in New Mexico. And she's also a part of the Globe Mission Earth program and has been a part of the Globe Mission Earth program for a while now. In addition to being a formal educator now, she's been with education, I believe, for more than 13 years, working with students of various grade levels and all on the science field. She's an atmospheric scientist by trade, and she's going to present today on her work that she's doing with her students on data literacy and storytelling with her students. So Christy, without further ado, take it away.
Thank you. And I just want to say before I get started, I have absolutely no qualms about being interrupted. If you have a question or you can't hear me or can't see something, I teach sixth graders all day. I don't need to know. If you have to use the restroom, please don't tell me. But for anything related to my talk, I have no issue with being interrupted. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if I can view this full screen as present. Does that look okay?
Yep.
Okay. So if you came to NARM, you might be a little bored. I haven't changed this much. I did change a little bit of one of the worksheets that I presented.
Ooh. Wait, are we recording? Oh yeah, good. Just
Yes,
I want to make sure
recording.
because I have some folks who couldn't come and they said, we want to see the recording afterwards. So, okay, thank you. Sorry.
Awesome. Thanks, Janelle, for checking. So I want to say before I get started that what I'm talking about is data literacy in my classroom, my sixth grade classroom. Technically in New Mexico, I am still at the elementary school level, but I think that the strategies that I'm going to show you are very applicable across really K-12 and even in at the undergraduate level as well. So I'm going to talk about who I am. I'm going to, for the 37th time, move the Zoom windows. I'm going to talk about why I care about data literacy, and then I'm going to give you 3 techniques that I use in my classroom. So on the right, you see the data literacy pyramid, which I actually found from an article on medium.com. And I really, really, really like this pyramid because there are lots of different ways that we use data, and there's a lot of different interests in data. So you'll see from my experience, I have been at the top of the pyramid. I've created data sets and I've used that data to write papers, right? Well, for me personally, I don't need my sixth graders to be able to create a data set, right? I think we're going to try to this year, but really for my purposes, I want them to be able to find simple data if they need to. I want them to be able to understand the data and read it and interpret it and evaluate it, right? So if you're thinking about data literacy, one of the places to start is thinking about the purpose and why. Maybe, yeah, okay, I love this pyramid too, Joseph, and I cannot find the original article that this came from. I looked at every article that was cited in the news article and I couldn't find it anywhere. So if anybody comes across this pyramid in any of your data literacy literature, please send me an email and let me know. So let me see. I don't usually use Google Slides like this. Okay, there I go. Okay, so who am I? I have a PhD in atmospheric science, and I have been, like Tracy said, an environmental educator for 13 years. Before I was in New Mexico, before I taught at McCurdy, I worked at New Mexico Wildlife Center, and I was involved in solely in environmental science. And then before that, I did outreach and education in Salt Lake City, Utah. But I'm in my 3rd year of teaching 6th grade, and I am also an extreme data junkie. And my students know this about me, and they kind of make fun of me for it. I have a Garmin watch. I'm also a runner. And right now it's in that stage where the battery doesn't last as long. And so this is like a crisis for me, right? When my battery gets below 10%, I really like data. I just find it to be really interesting. So why do I care about data literacy? This is a really great example that I found this summer. I was going to travel to the Southeast US to visit some family. And I wasn't really sure if traveling was a good idea because of COVID. And so I saw, this was actually, I pulled from Twitter. And so does anybody, here, let me see, get to where I can see everybody. Who can see a major difference? Who was not at NARM can see a major difference in these figures?
It's getting worse.
How do you know that?
I looked at the legend, and so the red has a different scale than the red on the right. The later one has a different scale than the one on the left.
Yeah,
But-
that's exactly right.
But the visual, you wouldn't see that because the red dots look the same.
Exactly. This actually represents something that I used to get in big trouble for in grad school if I changed the scale, right? Like you can change the scale to make things look how you want. But if I showed this, like, no offense to my mom, but if I showed this to my mom, who is not a scientist, she would look at this and say, well, Christy, everything looks fine. It's not getting any worse. You should come home and hang out, come see us, right? When in reality, in 15 days, the number of cases was up quite a bit, but they disguised it. I mean, I don't know if they intended to, they disguised it with the scale there, right? So in the world that we live in today, there are a lot of people with a lot of strong and different opinions. And if you are somebody trying to make a specific case, it is possible to present data in a way that supports your case, where somebody who did not look at the details of this picture wouldn't necessarily get the whole picture, right? So how do you teach middle school students about data literacy? Because I don't know about middle school students in other states, but my middle school students don't really care about anything, right? They care about when recess is, they care about their Snapchat or their TikTok, right? So how do you teach them about it? We're going to look at a couple different aspects of data literacy. If you're trying to teach middle school students about data literacy, it's really important, in my opinion, to start with data collection. And Globe is a great way to do that. And I know you all are familiar with Globe, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. But one of the two areas that my students struggle with the most are data analysis and data interpretation, right? They get a lot of data organization and visualization in math class. By the time I get my students, they've been graphing data for some time, but they're not great at analyzing and interpreting more complex graphs. So I want to help them practice data analysis. That I need them to be able to answer the question, what story does the data show? So my first strategy is to drive them absolutely crazy with questions. Ask questions for every single graph your students look at. And 10 minutes before I started this talk, I was in my science class and we were looking at one of the graphs on the My NASA Data Urban Heat Island story map. And this was the question I asked: what story does the data show? What's on the x-axis? What's on the y-axis? What's the blue dashed line? What's the orange line? So what does this show? This is really, really, really important, right? So this is a graph that I used about a month, maybe a little over a month ago in my class. And this is also a My NASA Data graph from the hurricanes as a heat engine story map. And my students don't get a whole lot of science before they reach 6th grade. They had no idea what a power dissipation index meant, right? My students, when we started this story map, didn't know the difference between a hurricane and a tornado, right? I mean, we don't have hurricanes out here in New Mexico, right? So how are they supposed to know about it? When you start with these kinds of questions, so what's on the x-axis? The year, right? I started off this specific graph by giving them 2 minutes, and I timed it because I'm really bad about talking too much. And I said, in 2 minutes, I want you to pick out all of the pieces of this graph that you recognize. What do you recognize, right? And then I want you to tell me in the chat. So all of them recognize the year. Okay, I see the year, right? A lot of them recognized, okay, sea surface temperature. We've been talking about that in science. Nobody had any idea what power dissipation index meant. The double axes were very confusing. So if I just showed my students this graph and I started asking, if I didn't start by asking about the X and the Y axes, they would probably be really confused and they would probably just shut down. right? So when you start with the simple questions, first of all, you help figure out what they know already, right? And then you can work to meet them where they are and start with what they do understand and work from there. I do this literally every single time. Yes, Janelle, do you clarify use of axis and axes? I do, but that's not that, like data and datum. Those are not things that I am very good at as I'm talking. I don't think about them. So forgive me if I screwed that up. But yeah, I try to teach my students that. Are you typing? Sorry, I can't tell. I had them right. Okay, that's really good. It's been a long day. I had to teach long division remotely today. I can use all the coffee I can get today. So what I really what I'm trying to emphasize, I guess, is that asking these questions about different displays of data has to be a classroom routine. And so here are 3 different ways that I have used this recently. This top one, here's a map, and this is from our science curriculum. And this is where a model predicts accumulation of floating garbage. So before we started talking about that, before I jumped to the big question of why is the garbage collecting here? We started with, what is this? What does it show? What does the dark blue mean? What does accumulation mean? What is model shows? Model, what kind of model? Like a model car, like a model in a magazine, right? You have to ask lots of questions about every single data display until your students start asking those questions themselves. Over here, there's an example from the math book about a triathlon, right? I started with that. What's a triathlon? Because we don't have triathlons in Española, New Mexico. You know, a lot of my students don't bike or don't run or don't swim. So we started with that. What does it mean? Like, to compare their running times, that shows the difference between each person's time and the average time. So is it better to be faster, right? You have to ask a lot of questions about data. If analyzing graphs, maps, and charts becomes a routine part of the classroom, students are going to be better prepared to produce their own charts, right? If your end goal is to have your kids doing globe projects, start asking them the questions that you want them to be able to answer about their projects when you see different data displays in math and in science and in social studies and in any class. So strategy 2 is to discuss and then write, right? I think this right here is how my students picture me sometimes when I ask them to do this. So I take the story and I transform it into a question. So my example, oh, I'm really bad at Zoom today. Okay, my example from the previous one, how does PDI relate to sea surface temperature? So one strategy that I use with my students a lot is called RACE. And I've taught them this, and we start with really easy questions. The R means restate the question. So in your answer, number 1, restate the question. Number 2, you answer the question. For C, you cite evidence, specific evidence, right? I tell them, I want to see a page number. And then for E, you explain or expand your answer or your evidence, right? So I'm going to show you a couple different examples. This is also from the Hurricanes as a Heat Engine story map. And so the question is, using what you have learned about hurricanes as heat engines, write a paragraph explaining why hurricanes occur during this particular season, which was fall, right? It's some late summer, fall. Use evidence from previous parts of this lesson to support your claim. So I asked my students to write this as a race. And here's an example. The student says, the water gets hotter in the summer and early August. So that kind of this was also one of the first times we did this during the year. So the hurricanes get stronger in hotter water. And then you look at the C, and this is where you can really tell a lot about what your students are understanding. Are they just parroting what they hear? Or are they pulling actual data, thinking about the data, and then citing that data? On the Hurricanes as a Heat Engine website, it shows you a hurricane simulator. When it's summer and you hold the hurricane over hot water, it gets stronger and stronger. So we spent a whole 20 minutes of class having a contest to see who could have the strongest hurricane. And they were super engaged in that. They all wanted to have a Category 5 hurricane, right? And we had one student who never ever talks in class, and he was the one who was able to create the strongest hurricane. And he was so proud. And so everybody who answered this question as a race cited that specific example. I remember in class that this is what this student did to create the Category 5 hurricane. So here's another example. That's kind of nice. This student mixed up and kind of, this is exactly what the student put. So they kind of put the E up above with the R and the A. I think this strategy is a fantastic way to get students writing about data. I try to use this strategy for every single question I ask my students. So once they can analyze a graph, once they can say, okay, what story is the data, or the story is the graph showing us, then we have to say, okay, so now we have all this data. This is what's happening with the data, but what does it mean? And can we use this to support a conclusion? So how can we help our students move from explaining what the graph shows to saying, okay, so now what does this mean, right? So here is my third strategy. Make sure, so first, number one, you have to make sure that they have the background to understand the data, right? And that's part of that asking questions. Ask what's on the x-axis, what's on the y-axis, what's the blue line, what's the orange line, right? What PDI? Okay, so let's talk more about PDI. By the time we did what I'm about to show you, we had spent some time on hurricanes, right? So the next thing I do is this activity called the gist. You have to help them understand the gist of the data. And I want to show you, so I want to show you where this came from. This gist strategy is an AVID strategy. AVID is a college prep program, but all of the tools that I have learned in AVID are applicable to anybody, anywhere. They're very, very helpful. So with the gist for reading, you start by looking at the who, what, where, when, why, and how of the article, right? And then you write a 20-word gist. So I always say, okay, if you're going to go home and sit down at the table at dinner with your family, tell me how you would explain that article to them in 20 words or less, right? So I've been looking at this gist for reading, and my students have done several. I think I have some examples. So this is in our hurricane unit. We read excerpts from an NPR article called The Tempest at Galveston. There were parts of it that were definitely too violent for my students to read. But here you can see one of my students created this gist. There was a hurricane in Galveston, Texas in 1900, and people had no warning and died. So do you feel like you understand that article based on that? Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really great example of a student who is able to take a 2 or 3 page article and boil it down to 16 words, right? I do have this template that I will share the link with you as soon as I'm done. If you ever use this with your students, my recommendation is to show them an exemplar first. I didn't do a great job of that. And so I also got this as well, where they did the who, what, where, when, why, and how, but then they kind of created a word soup, an adjective soup down here describing what happened, right? So I was using this gist for these different readings, and I actually got to talking with Tracy, and I said, wouldn't it be cool if we had something like this for data, for graphs, for visualizations, right? So here's what I've been working on is the gist for data. I've changed it a little bit, but basically it gets students thinking about questions when they look at any kind of a chart or a graph. So you have the title up here at the top, and you have the data source. You write about who created the graph, when was it created, why was it created, what data does the graph show, and then explain the graph or chart in 20 words or less. So this is an experimental worksheet that I've been trying to use with my students. It has not been, we haven't used it very many times. It's been kind of successful, but the first couple times that I've done this with my class, I've picked kind of complicated charts. One showed temperature and precipitation at the Albuquerque airport for all of 2020. And so they've had a little bit of difficulty with the charts I've picked. I haven't picked the best examples. I would like to refine this and have different versions, like a version for maps versus like the one I showed at the beginning compared to, yes, that's a great question. How is the data taken? How is the data collected? Let me write that down real quick. How is the data collected? So, and another thing that I added was what are the independent and dependent variables. That was some feedback I got after NARM. So I think that getting students to write about data in this manner is a really important tool to help a teacher understand how much your students are able to interpret data, but also to have students take a much longer and deeper look at a data visualization and understand it. So in summary, I definitely am not an expert at this, right? And every single class is different. My, I guess, main idea that I want to get across is that asking questions about data is really, really, really important. It's really important for students, right? And that's an important teaching technique. Don't they say you're supposed to ask, I think it's like more than a question. At some point, we were told that we were supposed to be asking like 3 questions per 4 minutes in our classroom or something like that, right? That's a lot of questions. And questions help my students stay engaged, in my opinion, from what I've seen, even remotely, right? If I'm asking them a question and asking them to respond to a question, even if it's something simple like, hey, do you guys see how the blue line goes up here and the orange line goes down, and they can type yes or no? That is a very important tool in helping them understand data. So you guys, I believe, have, yeah, data fluency. I think you guys have my contact information. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. And I want to share with you the links for these different GIST documents. So they are on a Google Doc. And it should ask you to make a copy of them. And hopefully we will not have, I think the first one is for writing and the second one is for data.
Hey, Christy, on that data one, and you mentioned this, you posed a little bit differently, but more of a scaffolding for,
Here, I'm going to just share.
Yeah, can you share the data one? The
Yes.
data gist?
Let me zoom in.
Yeah, it's all good. So a couple things. One, I'm wondering from a scaffolding standpoint, if we could switch and do the word, the bottom part, switch that and put that up top and fill in just in different places some key terms. Like they're looking at a chart, right? They're looking at a map, they're looking at a graph, they're looking at whatever you want them to look at, a table, and put in at the beginning on a scaffolding approach, maybe the label of the y-axis or the label of the, year and, color and, just a few things like that. And then you scaffold it along so that at the end, you don't need to put those words in there, right? Because they've gotten to the point where, oh yeah, the x-axis, the thing on the bottom or, whatever it is, right? But then from that word bank, using that word bank up top, then you ask those questions on the bottom, right? And they can not only refer to these phrases or terms of the word bank, but also they still have that visual to answer those questions like, when was the craft created, something like that, or what year or time span was given in the graph. So maybe in a scaffolding approach, we could flip it.
I think that's an awesome idea. And I think that would be very, very appropriate, especially for elementary. One of the things I'm running into as I'm trying to use this particular worksheet, I format it formatted it, based it off of this, right? This gist, which this template has been very successful in my classes. The data version needs to be different for different types of data, in my opinion, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense to ask independent and dependent variables if you're looking at a map, right? So one of the things that I would like to do next is break this apart and have different options. An option for a map, an option for a line graph, an option for a bar graph. And it may not have to be that complicated, but it's a little bit, not every graph. So that one of the graphs that I started off showing my students, who created the graph or the chart? Well, it had the National Weather Service Albuquerque logo up in the corner, right? When was it created? Well, that one that I based this on, it had the time that it was created, the actual day and the time, right? So not every data visualization has those things. So I would like to break it apart, and maybe I like it being simple in one page, but I'm thinking that maybe it needs to be 2 pages, because I really like the idea of almost like brainstorming and writing different keywords and having like suggestions for where to look for the keywords is important. But I think it's also really, really important for students to be able, because one of the things that my class in particular is really not good at this year is creating any kind of a summary of what they've seen, right? So I want them to be able to look at this graph of like precipitation, the precipitation year in Albuquerque, and how much lower we are than normal. And I want them to be able to take that data and put their thoughts about it and what it shows into words and read it back to me. So maybe it just needs to be more than 1 page. Maybe the front page is a brainstorm and different questions about it. And then on the back, they try to create a concise summary of what they're seeing. Does that make sense?
And there were a few comments in the chat about data literacy cubes, Christy.
I can't even see the chat. Hang on, I'm trying to find it. You guys, Zoom is a chat. Oh, here it is. Yes, the data literacy cubes are totally awesome.
And they're perfect for that age level. And
they are,
yeah, wonderful.
And
yes.
Janelle made some comments on card sorts.
Yes.
And sentence frames.
Yes, and looking for patterns, all of these things. These are all really, really important.
You're doing
my students, what's really interesting is that my students aren't good. They don't understand. If I say, look for the pattern, they really don't get it.
I was just gonna say, Christy, I love that you're breaking this down. Even 6th graders, as you're saying, often 6th graders just, we make them afraid of science and math when we assume that they get it, and they need so many opportunities to get it, and so many opportunities to look at data and work with data before we kind of ask them to do things that they don't understand. So you are asking all the right questions, and I really love how you're using questioning and really allowing them to interact with this science without feeling stupid. Because I've just seen so many times where we make the kids feel that they just can't do it because we get too complex too fast. And you're asking all the right questions.
Thank you. I think that's really, really important. And I think even though my students are in 6th grade, like I mentioned, they haven't had much science at all before they come to my class. And our curriculum is based off of NGSS, and it assumes that they've had a great deal of science before they walk into my classroom. And so, I feel like I can't assume anything at all. We really have to go back to basics. I have not used CodeApp. What I've started using, I'm going to stop sharing now because I feel like I'm in my classroom, actually. One of the things that I just used for the first time last week is this fantastic website that maybe Elizabeth, if she wants to elaborate, a website called Tuva Lab. where it's got just absolutely fantastic data visualizations. And we tried that for the first time in my class last week, and my students thought it was the coolest thing they've ever seen. We did a little lab with altitude and pressure and boiling water temperature. And I'm trying to get a classroom set of IR thermometers, and I'm hoping that we can create our own data set and look at that.
Christy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hey, this is Elizabeth. So
Hey.
thank you so much for all you're doing with data literacy. It's really exciting. And I was just wanting to mention someone spoke of CodeApp, and CodeApp's awesome. And I highly recommend CodeApp. It's an NSF funded data visualization tool. But Tuva is like CodeApp, just to the extreme. Of course, it is a paid for program, so it is a proprietary program that does have a subscription cost to it, but there are opportunities to host, I think, up to 5 free data sets as a teacher, and you can set up your classroom with Tuva. So if you guys haven't tried it out, I recommend that you do. There are a lot of different earth science data sets in there, and it's a lot of fun, and you can change out different data visualizations. So you have opportunities to create not just line plots or bar graphs, but you can try out histograms and scatter plots. And so it's a really great tool.
Do you want me to show that?
Do you have time?
Do we have time? Is that okay?
Yeah, we have 12 minutes. So, but if folks, want to, while Christy's pulling this up, if you wanted to put other questions or comments in the chat while she's doing that, that would be great.
I have it pulled up already. If you guys want to see what it looks like, I think it's super cool for data visualization.
Yeah, let's go there.
Okay. So this is the lab that my kids did. My students, I feel like they're my kids, right? So it's nice. It has some information about, they thought that this picture of this guy was really funny because it's an older picture. So as your, like if we, let me see, you can assign this, but I'm not seeing where maybe I previewed it or something. Assign, well, anyway, it walks your students through different steps. So one of the first steps was to you just drag the variable to the axis and the website plots it for you, right? So one of the first steps was to plot altitude to pressure. You can color it by an attribute, right? So for boiling point, or, what we ended up doing is altitude and boiling point right here. So this is what we ended up looking at. You can create a line graph with one click. Not that it makes much sense for this, but you could do a pie chart with one click. You can do a bar chart. Some of these don't make any sense for this data set, but you have a lot of different options for how to visualize data. Even with the dot plot, you can add in a regression line.
And Christy, that's a lesson in itself.
Oh,
Data
yeah.
visualization, which data visualization matches the data you want to try to answer in your question, right? So as you said, a pie chart doesn't make any sense. That's not going to help us. So that in itself can be a lesson within, the content area.
Absolutely. And I actually kind of, when we worked through this, I did that a little with my students, and I kind of, I hit pie chart and I said, does this make any sense? And they were like, I'm not confident enough to answer that.
Yeah.
But I've been very impressed with, I've only been playing with this website for a week and a half or so, and I've been very, very impressed.
I love how you started with the COVID map and that critical literacy piece. How much do you do that with your students? And do they seem to get kind of excited about being able to, sleuth that kind of stuff?
I haven't shown them that yet. I frequently at lunch, I look at the news, right? And anytime I see a cool graph or map or interesting article, I share it with them when they get back from lunch. And I've done this for a couple of years now. And they do think that that is very, very exciting. I think it's still a little, I don't think that they feel super confident yet with data. If I showed them a link from something like that COVID map and I said, tell me about this, maybe one or two would really feel confident contributing that. But part of the issue is the remote learning. That's been a very big hurdle, and it's taken a lot longer than normal for my students to feel confident or even comfortable answering challenging questions. Mm-hmm. They are not in a place where they are okay with taking big risks right now.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think part of that's just what's going on in the world. I don't think that's just New Mexico. I think that's a lot of places.
So Christy, I shared, and Janelle, I shared a COVID map with a group of students this morning. It was data up to November 4th. And I just simply said, based on the information in this graph, it was a graph. Obviously it was like, and I simply asked a question, are we ready to go back to in-person learning? And it was fabulous. It was a fabulous question and discussion, right? Because they had to interpret the axes on the graph. They had to interpret what the graph was doing. And they had to make a prediction of whether or not, they thought it would continue to go up. And if so, would that indicate, or would it go down? Would that indicate the next steps in terms of remote learning? So just something as simple as a warm up like that. Oh my gosh. Great conversations.
And that kind of thing is so engaging because they're living it, all the time. So right away they have an opinion, or they, it's a hook, it's easy hook, something like that. So that's great.
Does anybody else have any really fantastic, simple exercises that they've done in their classroom that work?
I wouldn't say it's a simple activity, but because I support the Global Precipitation Measurement Mission, I have been working to find ways that I can show students data from what we call iMerge. So we're pulling together at that point in time data from the satellite and also some other ground validation and ground rain gauge data as well. And so taking that very, very complex data, and that's where I was just delighted to find the data literacy cubes, and helping them to unpack what they're looking at and then giving them a real world context. Recently, we worked with talking about wheat and the importance of wheat, and what does wheat need to grow? And then talking about water and looking at two of the major wheat producing places around the world, one being Kansas, so that we would take a place that felt more familiar to. By and large, we were looking at students in the United States, and then taking a place in Pakistan, that's also a major wheat growing region, and then showing them the data and having them work with the data literacy cubes to unpack that data and looking at it seasonally over the past 20 years. And it really does take a lot of scaffolding and supporting, but also giving them time, giving them, laminated sheets to work with. In this case, we actually were doing it in the spring. So it was using virtual, teaching. And so the kids would have, their own copy to look at, and they had the week to, look over it and then work in small groups and try to, discuss what were they finding. And again, with the data literacy cubes, they came with some nice worksheets that are scaffolded as well that you can use. And so just, you put those together, find some neat real world data, find an authentic, application, i.e. in this case, what it was in Pakistan, they have problems with freshwater insecurity. And so using water when they didn't need to, when irrigating using river water, if they knew that precipitation was coming, and they were able to find that out just by getting a text on their phone because of government officials who were analyzing and massaging the GPM data. But the kids really understood it. And then we could even go into talking about insurance and micro insurance policies and how you can also use that data for that sort of thing. And most of them, when we started, didn't even know NASA collected Earth data. So just lots of fun ways. I mean, I just find that so exciting to be working with students and giving them the data and then stepping back and seeing where are the muddy areas, where do they still have this this need to know.
That's really cool. And that would be really to look at iMerge, look at comparisons between like GPM and rain gauges in arid areas like New Mexico when it's really dry and a lot of the precip is virga. That would be really cool.
All right. Well, we have a little bit under 2 minutes here. If anybody has any questions or comments for Christy or wants to share anything.
I just stuck a link in the chat there that does do exactly what Christy said. It shows how to get the iMerge data and then how to get your globe precipitation data and compare and contrast it. If any globe students send that to me, I'll send them a certificate of achievement from the GPM mission.
Very cool. Thank you.
I want to say thank you for your great presentation. And it's not the first time when I'm attending, and every time I am enjoying it and learning something new. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank Christy for her time and energy in the middle of her day, in the middle of packing us into one of her lessons for the day. I'm sure we all appreciate your time and energy and expertise in being in the classroom and doing this hands-on with students and giving us that kind of critique and feedback for our work with teachers and pre-service teachers. So thank you so much.